strong power to it. And so, yes, too, there's a magnetic element here we're talking about. But I wanted to start by discussing a little bit about it. And if I run out of time tonight, I'm going to pick it up again next week to finish, because there's quite a bit to say, but I'll try to keep it concise. The thought in my mind was, I'm sure all of you have been to many weddings. You know how they are. They take some of them are simple, but others of them can be quite elaborate and a lot of preparation, and starts way ahead of time, months and months, sometimes way ahead of time, prepping all the guests, can go up in the hundreds of guests, and the expense, and all the to-do that goes with it. It's exhausting. And finally, it comes time for the wedding and the big affair, and people come, and it's like, and then the wedding is over, and I think that there's a big sigh of relief. That's that's finished, and now people can get on with their lives. Especially, you know, the groom and the wife, husband and wife, get on with a life to start their marriage. And you look at and then again, I was think about the movies, Bollywood, Hollywood, everywhere in between. They're basically the romantic comedies, which are the staple of so many movies. They're pretty much similar themes, you know, a little bit, you know, maybe the setting's a little different, the language a little different. Basically, boy meets girl, troubles ensue, they're attracted, they get, you know, misunderstandings, opposition. You fill in the blanks. You've seen enough movies like this, and eventually at the end there's resolution, and they get together, they get married. And again, that's the end. It leaves you hanging right there. But that's not the ending at all. That's only the beginning. Because those of us who are married, have been married, we know that that's just the beginning of a very long journey that's going to take a lot of effort, a lot of attention, a lot of conscious awareness going into making something that is consuming to a large portion of our life, to be able to make that successful and to integrate that into it. And we know that the journey is not always a smooth one. There's ups and there's downs, there's misunderstandings, there's everything that comes in between. But there's the ability of that process, which is not for everyone, to transform a person and teach them, as Master said, life's for our education, but oh, how few are educated or entertained. And it's the same with marriage, that it's that way. Now, I've often been, people approach me, I'm married, and I'm sure many of you are married, some of you perhaps not. And I think one thing we all do have in common here, though, is that we are seekers of something higher in life. We're seeking God, or if we don't define it quite like that, we're seeking some higher potential, we're seeking truth. But I think let's use the word God here. We're all seeking God, and as if we weren't, we probably wouldn't be tuned into this lecture series that we've been doing. We probably wouldn't be associated with Ananda Sangha. And that is the common frame. Sometimes people ask me about, well, they're very sincere about God. Maybe they're single. It's still at that time. It says, which is the higher path, to be married or to be single? And if I'm seeking God, well, I should stay single. Isn't that the case? Because there's societally, culturally, there is amongst some people this implanted thought, well, if you're seeking God, really, one should be single. And you either seek God or you get married. People even frame it in that way, and we know that that's not true at all. You're either seeking God or you're not seeking God. Although on the deepest level, everybody is seeking God, they're just not conscious of it yet. So if you've made a decision that you want something more in life, you want God in your life, then whether you're single and seeking God, whether you're married and seeking God, whether you're a monk seeking God or not, these are individual decisions that are based upon your karma, the dharma that you feel for yourself in life, and either one of those, any of those paths can be quite successful or not. They're a means to a common end that we share, is to learning the lessons of life that have come to us from the situation and the karma that has come to us, and making the best of those situations and of all circumstances, extracting the lessons and applying them so that we're improving, we're growing in understanding, we're coming closer to God of what we want. And I cannot say that one path is better than another path. It's what we make of that path that really determines that. Now, there are outward circumstances involved here, and you could, you know, a single person versus a married couple is one thing, but then also those of us who have children know that a married couple without children versus a married couple with children, there's a big difference in that as well. And all of them, whichever one of those paths we choose, there's fulfillment, there's obstacles, there's going to be difficulties. There's simply just the differences. Now, I just, so that you know, I've been married quite a long time and have raised a daughter, so I know about having children. And I must say, looking back on it, I think that was one of the highlights, the best things that in my life was to raise a child and to help them grow up. I have to say that there's a few things that are highlights in my life, obviously coming onto the path, having a guru, those spiritual things, but in an outward sense, that experience is something that I wouldn't trade because it was very, very meaningful, and the lessons it taught me were priceless. And so obviously I have to look back and say, well, it was my karma, I needed that. And Divine Mother arranged it so that maybe I learned those lessons. Let me just say I learned the lessons. I at least had an opportunity to try to learn those lessons. Now, whether I not have or not, we'll see. But that was special for me. So you can't put it in terms of one is better than the other. They each have challenges. I will say, if you look at it, there are certain commonalities that we have to pick that question up by, that we're all seeking God, whether you're married, and the certain principles apply to whichever path that life takes us down. And that's, in both cases, if we're seeking God, the path of renunciation applies. Now, if you're married and you may think, renunciation, that's not for me. I'm a married man. Renunciation, those people that give up everything and they go into the mountains or they go into a monastery, and that's not what it is. That's not a true understanding of what renunciation really is. Renunciation is what all devotees, the path that all devotees must embark upon. And it's renunciation of our ego, renunciation of those ego tendencies, renunciation of that sense of me and mind and me first, and the renunciation of those habits of selfishness. That is the essence of what the spiritual path is all about, the transcendence of the ego. So then you have to say, well, which one of these paths is better for that? Now, I think personally, either one is going to be fine, but renunciation of the ego, in order for you to be successfully married, is forced upon you, or else you're going to not have a very good marriage, because you're right there having to confront the situation that's going to be giving that ego a shock. Whereas if you're single, you can hide from those challenges a little bit. So I'd say in some senses, marriage is, if you want to give yourself challenges, which I don't necessarily recommend you go out and solicit challenges in life. Divine Mother brings enough of them, but certainly I could see marriages in terms of ego flattening, like Master underwent under his guru, Swami Sri Yukteswar, is right there in the bargain of being married. And if you want to be successful, now this is why some marriages are not successful, because people will not submit and learn the lessons of learning to submit to that ego flattening process. But on the other hand, being single and being has its advantages too, because the one advantage I could see being single has is that it allows you to choose your environment more freely. And because so consequently, you're not bound by external circumstances, particularly family and other people to consider, and all of the duties that attend to marriage. And so consequently, when you're single, you have more freedom in that sense. But freedom is only good if you make use of it in a proper way. And so you find people, they have freedom, but they don't necessarily make good spiritual use of that freedom. And being single in and of itself can just give you license simply to do what you like and immerse you even worse in your egoic tendencies. But if you have consciously taken up the path of spirituality and you're single, well, it does allow you to spend more time and more perhaps you're not having to attend to the duties of a householder. So there are pluses and minuses on both sides of it, but both of them are based upon renunciation. They're based upon that giving up of that little self for something higher. Now, you could also say, if you look at that there's something similar here as well. Both renunciation, if you become formally a monastic, let's say if you take it to that extent, versus marriage, they both involve a vow. And to whom do we take that vow? Now, in a marriage, we think I'm taking a vow to my marriage partner. Isn't that so? When we do take vows. But on a deeper understanding, we're taking a vow to God. We're taking a vow to God in the form of that marriage partner. Isn't that so? On the deepest level, if we should understand it that way, that it's not the personality of the person to whom we're married, it's God in the form. Sita marries Ram. Ram marries Sita. And that's how we should look at it. And so consequently, we take that vow to God. Just as a single person, if they choose to become a monastic, they take that vow to God also privately, one to God, one to one. But if we're married, let's see it also in that way. It's God serving God, as Paramahansa Yogananda said to his disciples. God serving God in the form of that other person and that partner. Marriage involves, and this is maybe as opposed to a single person, obligations and specific duties, whereas perhaps being a single person is a little bit freer in that regard. But usually, if you belong to an order or monastery, there becomes duties and obligations as well. And we do have duties and obligations if we're dedicated to our spiritual path. We set them for ourselves as disciples to take on those duties and obligations. If you're not going to serve a family, you are under obligation to serve something higher. You're under obligation as a devotee and as a seeker of God to serve the world as your family. This is the temptation of being single, is because it seems you think you can wall yourself off and not have those duties like the householder has, but they're there. They just take a separate form. And you could say your family takes a separate form, and you have that obligation. As Lahiri Mahashaya said, as long as you're breathing the free air of this earth, you're under obligation to give grateful service. And so nobody escapes that. And the form differs and how it differs. There is something that Master Paramahansa Yogananda said. Now, just to remind you, of course, that Yogananda, most of his most advanced disciples were married. But of course, some of those advanced disciples were in marital relationships where the spouse didn't necessarily agree with their dedication to this guru, and they're a little bit of an opposition to some in there. Rajasi was in that situation where he had a very difficult time with his wife, but he was able to, you might say, outwit her spiritually, in that. So she really didn't fully understand his spiritual stature, but most of them were married. Now that just may have been a function of the social times in which he came. I don't know. But Master did once say, they asked a young person, a young man, I think it was, said, "Are you married or you're single?" He says, "Oh, I'm still single, sir." And he said, "Good, you're still on the safe side." Now the question is, he was on the safe side. Does that mean Master was against marriage? No, but he was stating an obvious truth there, a practical truth. Now, what is so risky about being married? And those of us who are married, have been married, we need to take these things to heart, because there are definite things that are detrimental if we don't pay attention to them. Yogananda used to talk about specifically the us for and no more consciousness that comes into marriage. Is we begin to have this small circle of affection to whom we feel duty, and we subconsciously and perhaps even consciously make a wall around ourselves. And so we do everything for our family. We make money for our family. We serve our family. We leave inheritance for the family. We pass power down in our dynasties that you see so much of in business and in politics as well. You to families. And there's a subtle wall, and this is not the right attitude for a devotee. The Master said we should, particularly the householder, should take the social path to God, which is one of expanding our sympathies. And you could say our family gives us an example and a tool by which we can express the love of our heart and expand our sympathies, one, to a spouse, two, if you have children, you expand those sympathies very naturally to your children, but don't leave it there. It's our duty then to say, okay, now I expand my sympathies to include my neighbor, my extended family, my employees, my co-workers, my friends, my fellow devotees, my larger sangha, to the world at large. And in each case, as we expand our sympathy, the world becomes our family. As Master said at the conclusion of his autobiography, "Lord, Divine Mother, you've given this monk a very large family." And that's how it should be. We should feel by a certain point in our marriage that everybody's part of our family. Yes, we have certain relationships, close relationships with some more than others, but don't exclude anybody. And this is something that is very, very common. We wall ourselves off, the family, and then becomes a prison. It's not an opportunity. It's not something that we open to ourselves. It's us for no more. And the result of that is that our consciousness contracts. And we begin, and pretty soon we get immersed in a very worldly consciousness, providing for. Because if you're not expanding, the world doesn't stay neutral, you're contracting. And we think in terms of, oh, I have to provide this, I have to provide that. And you find yourself enmeshed in worldly consciousness, and you lose your faith in Divine Mother ability to provide, because you think you have this false sense of duty, responsibility for my children. These are my children. They're not your children, they're God's children. They're lent to you for a short period of time to help raise and bring up into adulthood. They don't belong to you. So many people, they raise their children and then they hang on to them. And if children don't satisfy them with their expectations, they get angry and they're possessive. This is not right. This is not proper. And so this sort of contractive spirit very easily can come into marriage and into family life, and this is a trap of the householder rather than it being a doorway to being able to expand something larger. So you could say then the other problem with, I've noticed that with couples, some couples, you could say, well, this is, let me back up. Swami Kriyananda gave a piece of advice to married couples. He says, work with each other's strengths and try to strengthen each other in those things that we're strong on. But what happens is many people, they try to cover up and they reinforce one another's weaknesses. And you'll see this. And sometimes a husband will be obviously wrong. And the wife will feel a sense of wifely duty. And of course, not to criticize him. I don't mean to say you should do that. But the other spouse will start agreeing with them and strengthening a person in their ignorance. And you see this because we're family after all. So we need to back each other up even if we're wrong, even if we're doing something wrong. Now, admittedly, tact is necessary to be able to help correct a person if their bad habits sometimes can be reinforced by a spouse. Enabling, in other words, is what happens. And you find one spouse enabling another in very negative behavior, and this is not good at all, where we should be models to one another. And it's because each of us have strengths and we have less strengths, weaknesses. I can't think of the right way to say weaknesses, but we're less strong in some areas than others. And this is as it should be. A wife might be very, steady and strong and stable, and you count on her, and the husband might be a little bit, flighty in his habits. On the other hand, the husband may be very expansive and courageous and outgoing, and that helps the wife, who might be a little bit more introverted. And so there's a balance begins to come, and we strengthen each other in giving our strength to the other and relying upon another's strength, not encouraging and backing up people's weaknesses. This is actually sometimes, unfortunately, thing that happens is you see a person, they're weak in a certain area of their personality, and they feel defensive and resentful if their spouse is not weak also in that way. It's a rebuke. They take their lack of having that fault as somehow a rebuke. And of course, the spouse has to use tact, and you can't use that against one another, but nevertheless, we should encourage always in a positive direction one another. And this makes for a good marriage. You do run across, and I'm not going to go into this in this class because it's too big of a subject. I may come back to it later on in a different classes. One partner is not supportive of the other partner in their spiritual endeavors. And what do we do about that? I realize that's a very important question, and but it's such a big one that it needs its own time slot for me to address that. I can't do that in the time allowed today. So probably next week when I come back, I'm going to have to finish with that one. And because I'd like to address that. And I've been asked this question so many times, and there are things that we need to consider with that. So let's put that one aside. But the other disadvantage, you could say, or obstacle to watch out for is sometimes when you're married, you find it's an excuse to get involved in worldliness. Have a good time with the senses, or to get involved in outward things because the temptation is there and the gratification potential for getting involved in outward things is easier there. So the lack of self-discipline in a marriage can be a very big obstacle. So you have to put attention to that as well. But this all works best if a husband and wife are mutually traveling on the same path. Just recently, we've been in another class series, we've been reading the autobiography of a yogi. And I was so impressed, again, reading about Master's mother and father, how they complemented each other so beautifully, and how what a lovely, lovely marriage that was, to see two people working in harmony. And they had 8 children. So people say, well, how am I ever going to find God when I don't have time? Well, look to Master's mother. What did she do? 8 children, that's not easy. But yet, she was saintly. Maybe she was a saint, probably. Father attended to his business and tended to his duties. Such a good examples to take. So don't use children, householdership as an excuse for not being able to do your duties in life and to be successful in your spiritual path. Now, there's a whole, and I can see I've run out of time already. I'm going to come back to this next week. I'm going to address that question of what if your spouse is not supportive, but tips on how to make your marriage work a little bit more successfully that you might do. And having been married a long time, personal experience comes into play a little bit on some of these things. But let's go on that next week, as I can see I don't have nearly enough time this week. But I would like to leave you with 2. And we'll use this as a foundation for our discussion next week. Now, this is something Master wrote in his book on expansive marriage, which, by the way, if you have not read and you are married, I very much recommend that you buy that book and read it. It's a good handbook because it addresses this from a point of view of principle, abiding by the high principles of what marriage is for, which is to help us as a pathway to self-realization. That happens to be our Dharma. But the 2 things he was saying is a good marriage is rooted or based, let's say, on a foundation of respect and courtesy. Now, think about those in the coming week. Respect and courtesy. If those are missing, there's going to be trouble. But respect and courtesy can be expressed, and it doesn't in many different ways. And it doesn't take a person to be a disciple on this path in order to express that. It's common human respect we're speaking about, common human courtesy that we're speaking about here as well. And so next week I want to, if you can, and by the way, during the week, send in your questions, and if you want to, so at this particular topic, and if it takes more than next week's discourse, I'll keep going. But this is a big topic, this topic of marriage, finding that Dharma in life, how to successfully navigate it. And the question I mentioned at the very beginning, why did I raise this topic? Well, it was the one person that did ask me a question a week or so ago about a topic that had to do with marriage a little bit. And it got my mind thinking, but there's a second one. And that's because today is Sadhana Devi, my wife, and my anniversary. We've been married today 47 years. And so, Sadhana Ji, if you're out there in the audience, I don't know if you are, but if you are, I'm sending you my love and my blessings. And I want you to know I'm going to be back in June at some point, I hope, God willing. And I send you all the greatest wishes of happiness in this lifetime. You've been a joy to me in my life, and I can't thank you enough for being such a good example. So until next week, let's think about these topics. Send me your questions, and happy anniversary to my wife. Joy to you.